Hi everybody, and welcome back again. This is another lecture where I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground, and although I'm posting this to YouTube as usual for the sake of consistency, I really want to emphasize audio-based delivery for this unit as much as possible, so this slideshow is pretty light on actual slides. You should feel free to just listen to it like a podcast if you want to do that. There are a couple of illustrative graphics later on, so I'll cue you when we get to those, but you can mostly just listen with your ears and not worry about staying glued to the screen for this one. So anyway, today I want to present a new perspective on thinking and learning in the form of the theory of embodied cognition, and talk a little bit about this theory and how it relates specifically to instructional design and to audio media and music. So let's actually start out with that second point first, because there is a reason I've chosen to introduce this theory as part of our first pass through audio media, and it's worth discussing a little bit just to contextualize things. If you think back to last week, you'll recall that one of the points about audio and sound that was brought up is that sound is a physical thing. It has energy and motion. It moves through time and space. And all of these are qualities that other media like graphics or text don't necessarily share, but they are qualities that we as physical beings share. We also require energy and motion to maintain our existence. We experience time and space, and so audio media are very directly compatible with our sort of hardwired way of experiencing the world around us. While writing and even representational images like a photograph can contain a lot of detail, but they are, in a way, much more abstract. They capture select aspects of experience, but always kind of a step removed from the real thing. Whereas a good audio recording of a singer or a speaker, if you close your eyes right now, it's honestly not very different from if I was really in the room with you saying these words right now. The sound of my voice is moving and hitting your ear in exactly the same way as if I was actually there. So what I'm proposing, essentially, is that our sense of hearing is our most obviously embodied mode of perception, which is why I'm bringing up embodied cognition alongside audio media. Now, I'm obviously not saying that vision or any of our other physical senses are not embodied, because that would be obviously wrong. But I am saying that we can be aware of audio perceptions more easily and more intuitively than we are aware of other sense perceptions as physical experiences. This has a lot to do with how our ears and our brains are put together. Part of it is developmental. In the Harmon reading, she mentions that a developing embryo can hear and respond to sound at about 4 months, which is less than halfway from conception to being born. Hearing is our first sense to really develop, which makes sense since there's not really much to see or smell or taste in utero, but it's even really more dramatic than Harmon suggests. Babies can recognize and respond to their parents' voices from birth, their mother's voice, and with a little work, the father's voice. If you have different voices talking to an infant, it will turn its face toward the mother or the father every time. Whereas for the first several months, a baby will respond to any visual image that looks even vaguely like a human face about equally. They just don't make those visual distinctions yet in those early months. And of course, babies communicate entirely through audio, as all you parents know. It's all yell and no show for quite a few months. Our audio perception is also intimately connected to our sense of our own bodies, what's called proprioception, which is the sense you have that lets you be aware of the different parts of your body and where they all are in relation to each other. Like, if you close your eyes, I'm telling you to close your eyes a lot, If you close your eyes, you can still put your finger on your nose without any trouble or having to think about it because you're just aware of your body. So that's proprioception. And our senses of proprioception and balance are located to a significant extent in the inner ear and depend on the same perceptual pathways as our sense of hearing. Inner ear injuries can actually be really devastating in this regard. If they damage these essential structures, you can not only suffer hearing loss, but have your proprioceptive sense knocked out of whack as well, so you can't coordinate your body parts. You can't tell where they are and maintain your balance. This might also have some bearing on our physical responses to music and rhythm, since these signals aren't just getting processed as sound, but also getting communicated to this bodily integrity system that keeps track of where our bodies are and their overall state of being. And so it can affect how we are aware of ourselves at a physical level. So why do we care about all that? Well, this is all scientifically and philosophically interesting, and I think that by itself should be enough to justify anything, really, but the embodied cognition perspective also has implications for instructional design. A lot of you last week honed in on the part of Bill Cope's lecture where he talked about the different affordances and constraints of a spoken classroom conversation versus a text-based, digitally supported conversation. He didn't actually use the terms affordance and constraint directly, but that's the concept he was talking about. And you all had some great thoughts and insights overall into that idea, but at the same time, from my perspective at least, that particular part of the video hasn't aged super well in some ways. These multiliteracy videos are from about 4 years ago now, which isn't all that long, especially in terms of instructional technology. There have been changes over the last 4 years, of course, but things like smartphones and video conferences and Google Classroom and Blackboard and all of that were already around in 2016. And so what Cope describes as sort of his dream classroom discussion with all the students posting to chat threads and all his parallel simultaneous participation in a primarily text-based conversation, he couldn't have predicted it at the time, but we're basically all the way there now already. This very suddenly became kind of the default model for teaching and leading discussions, and I can't speak for everybody, but I don't think that most teachers responded to that shift by breathing a sigh of relief. None of the teachers I know said, well, thank goodness, we can finally get rid of those outdated, one-at-a-time, speech-centric classroom discussions. So, as it turned out, everything Cope has to say about the affordances and constraints of different media platforms and modalities for having a discussion, that's all true and it makes sense, but then it also turns out that what he wanted is terrible in a lot of ways. It's not universally terrible all the time. It can be really good, but over the last few months it has been frequently terrible. So we're getting back to embodied cognition, but we're going to do it by way of comparison to constructivism, which is the theoretical tradition Calancis and Cope and a lot of the mainstream of educational research and thinking all belong to. So there's an illustration here for those of you just listening, if you want to come over and take a quick look at your screen. This is a graphic of the developmental stage model of Jean Piaget, who most of you who have a teaching background already have probably heard of. He is one of the 2 or 3 major foundational thinkers of constructivism, and as you can see, he established this model of 4 main stages of development from birth through the start of adulthood in the teens. And the line running through and connecting these stages into this sequence is improvements in the ability to construct mental models of things and each stage represents a set of major milestones along that path. So you can already see the influence on the multiliteracies theory. The idea of mental images or mental models is really at the center of everything for constructivists. And so the overall direction of Piaget's model, at least in the traditional interpretation, is towards increasingly abstract thinking, moving from the very concrete at birth to the more and more purely mental and abstract kinds of thinking, like higher level math or language analysis or creativity. Let's run through this spectrum in terms of hearing and audio development, since that's what we're supposedly doing this week. So in the first stage, the sensory motor stage, we spend about 2 years from birth to 2 just figuring out the real basics of sound. Babies can hear sounds from the very beginning. They can respond to them, and they pretty soon learn to make different sounds through a process of imitation, but it's all very immediate, just responding to the sounds they're actually perceiving right here and now. It's very much just a perceptual process. Then, starting by age 2, we hit the pre-operational stage, and now children start to do some symbolic thinking with sound and hearing. They learn words, they can recognize simple musical patterns in sound, they can ask what sounds are and what they mean, but it's all still very surface level. They're using these basic sound symbols and learning how they can fit together, but just obvious surface stuff like names of things, simple pitch, or rhythm recognition is what's going on at the pre-operational stage. Then by the start of the grade school years, around age 5 or 6, we hit the concrete operational stage where we start to get below that surface and understand deeper qualities and relationships between things in the world. We learn that sounds can be represented in other ways, like through letters. We learn how to produce groups of sound on a musical instrument to form whole chords or melodies. We can imagine the sources of sounds and start thinking about how to recreate them or say them in a new way, like reciting a memorized poem in different tones. And then finally, during adolescence and into adulthood, we transition to the formal operational stage where we can create these very sophisticated, fully mental models of things and do stuff like compose entire songs with different instrumental tracks, or translate a poem into a different language while preserving the cadence of the original speech, the rhythm of the sound. These operations that require us to hold multiple different real and imaginary sounds in our mind all at once and move them around and relate them to each other. And to a constructivist, that progress is basically the goal of learning, to get to that point where you have these complex, multifaceted mental models that let you do these really difficult and complicated and impressive things. Now, the limitation of all this is that constructivists get fixated on these mental models and see them at the center of everything. At the extreme end of things, a radical constructivist will say that thinking and learning isn't even really about the mind engaging with the world, it's about the mind constructing mental models and engaging with those to represent the world. There's, I think, the common interpretation of Piaget's framework for a long time was essentially that we outgrow these earlier, more concrete stages of development as the brain gets more sophisticated and the brain turns inward, and the real magic of cognition happens inside the mind where we can't actually see it. So the sensory motor and the perceptual processes kickstart things, but then we move beyond them. So in principle, to a radical constructivist, they don't really see much difference between a mind in a real body in a real environment, or a mind in an artificial body in a simulated environment, because both minds are actually engaging primarily with their own internally constructed models. So if the simulation is good enough, then the difference between real and constructed doesn't really matter. And so this is why Calancis and Cope's model kind of fails to anticipate that asynchronous technology-based classroom discussion might actually be terrible. They can explain the differences between that and traditional instruction and discussion, but fundamentally the underlying thinking and learning process is the same in a regular class or in a remote class or a socially distanced class in this model, because it's the same brain. It's all happening inside the same brain, and context is less central. And that's fine when we're talking about instructional design and technology-based teaching and learning and multimedia in an academic way, but then this stopped being an academic question very suddenly, and now we're here in this very different situation where we need a theory of thinking and learning that is going to help us describe and deal with the differences, the real differences that come with online and blended learning, and we need it immediately. So now we're finally getting back to embodied cognition proper, which very simply put is the theory that says we can't look at thinking and learning as just a thing that happens inside the brain. We have to understand this is a brain in a body in an environment, and the whole system out to basically as far as you can sense with your sight or your hearing. That's where the thinking and learning happens. Our cognitive system, our thinking and learning process includes things like our ears and our voice box and our mouth, and the shape of those things and the way they are designed and fit together actually acts as a constraint, not just on how we talk or how we listen, but a constraint on how we think. Like, there are no human languages that contain sounds that a human mouth can't produce. And if language is our way of representing and communicating about the world, then our ability to do that is shaped from day one by our physical bodies and how they handle processing sound and listening and speaking. And to move on from there, then any change in this whole embodied system, any change in those pieces is going to resonate through the whole system and impact the learning process, whether it's a temporary change or a permanent change. So we have to take all of this into account when we are designing learning environments and trying to observe learning as teachers or as developmental scientists. For a really simple example that we all intuitively understand, hungry kids don't learn. If a kid comes to your class really hungry, then you might as well just not bother, honestly, for the day with getting them to retain anything. And the embodied cognition theory backs you up. Like, of course, if the body that the brain rides around in is hungry, then the brain isn't going to be able to focus on anything that's not relevant to finding food. And we can look at that change through an embodied cognition lens and describe how that situation is interrupting the learning process. And that's the first step to actually fixing it. While on the other hand, constructivism doesn't really have the language to do that. I'm not saying constructivists don't understand that kids get hungry. I'm just saying the theory of constructivism itself doesn't really give us a tool or a lens to examine and solve that particular problem. And so when we look at online learning or at socially distanced learning through an embodied cognition perspective, of course it's different than regular in-person class. Our students are seeing us or not seeing us because of camera issues differently. The actual perceptual experience for them is different. They are hearing us differently. Our voices are actually different through a mask or a microphone. Their movement and their sense of their surroundings is different. The whole learning situation is different in ways that are really important to an instructional designer, even if the brain is the same brain and the mental model of like the Bill of Rights is the same mental model. Now, I'm not trying to come down hard on Calancis and Cope or on any constructivist. I'm very constructivist in my own thinking and interests and research. So I'm not saying they're wrong about anything. I'm just trying to add another perspective that we can use for solving these completely bonkers instructional design problems that we have to solve this year. Piaget himself wasn't taking a hardcore stance focusing on mental models above everything else. What he was saying, and I think he's been misinterpreted, was that all of the complicated, high-level, abstract idea building that we can do over on the right side in the formal operational stage, all of that is built out of the same basic perceptual processes that a baby uses to hear and understand and imitate one sound. Throughout Piaget's life, he wrote that intelligence was fundamentally a biological process, that you can't separate the adult mind from the basic sensory motor toolkit of the baby mind. It's just built on that foundation. And we saw this thread coming back into the conversation in the multiliteracy videos over the last 2 weeks, that perception, that sensory process, is an important part of understanding learning. So now I'm just picking up that thread that the constructivists are starting to allow back in, and I'm cranking it up to 11 with a radically embodied perspective, just to contrast. And to be clear, I am not the only one doing this. Here's another illustration coming up for those of you who aren't watching your screen. So this is a graphic for current early literacy practices. This is a pretty widely used framework in libraries for early literacy programs. I'm betting some of you kindergarten and other early childhood specialists have seen this or something very similar to this. So these 5 practices or pillars that are supposed to get kids around age 2 to 5 ready for reading. So this is the pre-operational stage where they're doing initial symbolic thinking, pretty much exactly. And to get children in that stage ready to read, the experts are saying you need to use all 5 of these different symbolic modes equally, or roughly equally. And if you notice, 3 of them are very embodied modes of expression. Speaking, singing, and playing, these are all physical activities. So more than half of this framework, if you give everything roughly equal weight, more than half is modeling different modes of embodied thinking. We've been reading about how visual and audio literacy get neglected in most schools, and unfortunately, part of that is coming out of a hardline constructivist perspective that reading and writing are very efficient modes for building and sharing and assessing mental models, and so they get priority over messier or more complicated modes like singing and dancing and drawing that are more rooted in perception and rooted in thinking with our whole bodies, but don't cleanly fit in the idea of a purely mental modeling process. So the last thing I'm going to say to tie it all back to why I included this in the audio unit is that, in my opinion, and I think you could guess this from the way I'm conducting this course, in my opinion, audio and speech are possibly the best medium to try to re-embody the learning process in online or hybrid or socially distant teaching. Our ears and our sense of hearing really tie right to the core of our physical sense of self, which is why music does weird things to us emotionally and mentally. And good, thoughtful use of audio in our instructional designs can help us work around some of the constraints of difficult learning setups that we're dealing with this school year. So if you are interested in this embodied perspective, go back to last week's lecture, look again at the affordance and constraint section, and think about how you're going to use audio in your own lesson planning from an embodied perspective, where you're trying to account for the entire learning environment out to the range of what your student can perceive with all their senses and what their perceptions are and how that whole system is impacting how and what they are learning. So, you have a rough draft due at the end of this week, and this time around you'll be getting feedback as audio. I am going to give you the scores. I'll still score the rubric, but then the detailed thoughts and critique will be attached as a sound file for you to listen to as you read back through your draft. So while you are going over those, I would like you to think about how this feedback system is different from written comments. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Can you tell better when I'm teasing you and when I'm being really serious about something and all of that? I might even sing to you if I think it will help you improve your design. You don't know what I'm capable of. Whew. So I've talked for a very long time, and so I'm going to go rest up my voice in anticipation of that. I look forward to hearing your own thoughts about embodied cognition and your plans for designing with audio media, and I am going to go get some tea.